In today's video, we're looking at stops. I'm using a vintage film camera to help us illustrate this. This particular camera has a shutter speed dial that is adjustable in full stop amounts. The lens that I'm looking at is also adjustable in full stops, but it has indents at half stop positions. The ISO dial is also adjusted in full stops, but it has indents at third stop positions. So each of the settings on the camera have different precision, different granularity. I hope you enjoy. This nifty piece of equipment is a Praktica Super TL3. It's very much like my original camera that I had as a child. Praktica is famous for introducing new camera models that were identical to the previous camera model. This one is almost identical. It's got waffle finish. Yeah, my original camera, my LTL, didn't have a waffle finish. That seems to be a difference between the Super TL3 and the LTL. Everything else is more or less the same. This has a shutter speed dial right there. It goes from 1 second all the way to a 500th of a second on the full stop scale. Vintage cameras had the ability to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture. And depending on the way that we go, a full stop adjustment will either reduce the amount of exposure by half or it will double the amount of exposure. And it depends on the direction we're going. So if we're changing the shutter speeds from a slower shutter speed to a faster shutter speed on a full stop scale, we're reducing the amount of time by half. If we're going the other way, from a faster shutter speed to a slower shutter speed, we're doubling the amount of time. We're therefore doubling the amount of exposure. Each of the little stops on the shutter speed dial adjusts the amount of exposure by a full stop. Here's how it works. 1 second to a half second. Half the amount of time, half the amount of exposure. We're decreasing the duration of the shutter speed by half, from a full second to a half second. This particular lens, being the Arrestagon 29mm f2.8, means the widest aperture that it can be set to is f2.8. If we go from f2.8 to f4, we're adjusting the aperture by a full stop. When we adjust the aperture by a full stop, you're reducing the intensity of light by half. If you go from a smaller aperture to a wider aperture on a full stop adjustment, you're doubling the amount of exposure. The aperture barrel itself is marked in full stop adjustments, going from 2.8 to f22. There are indents between the apertures that are the half stop adjustments, so we can adjust this a little more finely than we can adjust the shutter speed, which are adjusted purely on full stop adjustments, whereas the aperture can be set to the intermediate half stops that fall between the full stop adjustments. If we're looking at the aperture scale, f2.8 to f4 is a full stop adjustment. It's half the amount of light that's transmitted when we make a one-stop adjustment to a smaller aperture. So if 2.8 is a wider aperture, f4 is a smaller aperture, it's a halving of the amount of light. If we go from f4 to f5.6, that again is a full stop adjustment. We're going half again in the exposure. So going from f4 to 5.6 is half the amount of light again, but it's 1/4 the amount of light that would be let in at f2.8. ISO is adjusted on the same way. We have ISO settings on this camera that can be set to intermediate settings, but they're marked on the ISO dial as 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. Probably tops out at 3200 on this one. I've never really checked. Perhaps I'll check. Old eyes. If I'm checking, I'm going to need these. It goes from ISO 12 to ISO 1600. There's a distinct difference between how ISO works with a film camera versus a digital camera. With a digital camera, each file is uniquely created, which means ISO can be changed on a frame-by-frame basis, meaning it's a viable process to change the ISO to adjust for different quantities of light at a particular location. The same can't be said for film. With film, we have to commit to shooting the entire roll at one particular ISO. There are two elements that come together to create ISO on a film: the size of the silver grains that make up the photosensitive emulsion, and the processing of the negative itself. Because there's no practical means to separate individual frames on a roll of film after it's been exposed, we have to commit to processing the entire roll at once, which means we can't change the ISO mid-roll. Because stops are equivalent, changes made to one control in the camera can be compensated for using the other. Here's a hypothetical. We've got a shady day and we have 400 ISO film in our camera. The amount of light that's there is giving us a combination of shutter speed and aperture for the correct exposure to be 125th of a second at f5.6. If we change the aperture from f5.6 to f8 to give us perhaps greater depth of field, we can change the shutter speed to a 60th of a second. That change of aperture from 5.6 to 8 would decrease the transmission of light by one stop through the lens, And that change of shutter speed duration going from 125th of a second to a 60th of a second would increase it. So there's no net change to the exposure by making those changes to both the aperture and the shutter speed. And we can continue to do that. We can go to increasingly slower shutter speeds and decreasingly smaller apertures. We may choose to do that for a number of reasons, perhaps to get an increase in depth of field, or perhaps to be able to use a shutter speed that's faster to freeze the action of a subject. We can use the tools on the camera to get a more creative output at the end. In the next couple of videos, I'll look more deeply into the creative uses of aperture and shutter speed. Have a great day.